Thank you. Thank you. And she talked me up there, and I just want to try to meet the level of you MSU folks. That was wonderful work that you're doing. I've learned so much being here today, so I want to thank you all. This is complicated. So I started at, I grew up outside of Laurel, Montana. I was closer to a little tiny town called Moult, Montana. Very small wheat farming community. And I graduated from high school. I went on to Dawson Community College, another very rural area in Glendive in eastern Montana. And I was actually there for 2 years, and then I went on to the University of Montana in Missoula. And that was a total culture shock for me to go from Glendive, Montana to Missoula, Montana, for a small town person like myself. But through my undergraduate work and then through my graduate work, I became greatly involved with the Montana Writing Project at the University of Montana. And we developed deep connections through our leadership to efforts surrounding Indian education for all. It's a law in the state of Montana, but it's also part of our state constitution, ratified in 1972. So for my research during my graduate work, I really wanted to take a look at that. I really wanted to know more about it. It's my duty as a public school teacher in the state of Montana to incorporate Indian education for all into my teaching. It was very early on in the process at that point, and I did not entirely understand what that meant, but I was very committed to prejudice reduction. I was wanting to reduce the amount of intolerant things that students in my classrooms were saying and doing. And I did present in Polson last year, but if you've been following the news, Polson made national news with the homecoming event. Two students, yes. Expressing intolerant, even white nationalist ideas through what they wrote on their t-shirts for a homecoming event, and took pictures of it, celebrating that. So that is just one instance when it came to the surface. I think those of us who are here from Montana know it's there, and it's been there, and it's still there. But I wanted to see how my classroom, my English classroom, could reduce that, could talk about that, could have conversations about it. And in my research, I came across Dr. James Banks' Introduction to Multicultural Education, and in there he describes the dimensions of multicultural education. And he never talks about it as a linear sequence, but I started to pick up on that as I read from him. Also, Dr. Tammy Elser adapted his work to Indian Education for All here in Montana, and I noticed that in her work as well. So as I started to look at it, dimensions of multicultural education, if we start with content integration to reduce prejudice, incorporating indigenous texts into the curriculum, incorporating indigenous ideas and beliefs and understandings into the classroom would be the first step toward that prejudice reduction. And then the next step would be to unpack the knowledge construction process. What do I know? What do I think I know? And how does this change what I think I know? And then there's prejudice reduction, that dimension that you reach where you actually are reducing prejudice within a community, and you work your way toward equity pedagogy where everybody feels equally represented within the curriculum. Native students, by and large, in Montana don't feel like they are represented in the subject matter, in the text, in the textbooks. And we need to reach that point where everyone feels equally represented in the topics that are discussed in a classroom. And that would lead us to an empowering school culture and social structure where every student feels empowered. Every student feels like they are part of that social structure within a school, and everyone is feeling supported and represented. What I noticed, and this is my fancy stick figure diagram, what I noticed is that there was a lot of resistance to that as I tried to implement that in my classroom. And I'm talking 10, 12 years ago, that students resisted that. They came quickly with their very intolerant ideas, and they had those intolerant ideas rooted at home. But I also had Native students in the room who had to put up with those intolerant ideas and the things that were said on a daily basis. And I wanted to get to a spot where we could have conversations and share understandings. And I didn't quite know what that would look like. But from studying Dr. Banks's work, I knew it had to be there. Okay, I had to be able to do it. If I'm a teacher, and my job is to influence students, to teach students, to expand, to open up their minds a little bit, I needed to find a way to get there. But what I came to find is that as soon as we could start unpacking that knowledge construction process, questioning our stereotypes, questioning what we think we know, then we could get to a spot where we start reducing prejudice. From there on, it became very easy to create an empowering school culture and social structure. And trust me, I'm not saying everything's fixed in Columbus, like just the name, right? It would take me a long time to unpack that one. I don't have time for that today, okay? I'll get more to that later. But it was, of all places that this is needed, it's a town called Columbus, and just the arbitrary way, but maybe it's not so arbitrary, how that name came to be. But it became, there was less resistance. There was more natural momentum from that point of prejudice reduction to the point where we were reaching a spot where students all felt represented. All students felt encouraged and empowered. And students who had long remained silent in school, including in my classroom, began to speak and share what their thoughts were. And that was important. And so I needed to come up with a project. So I want to share a project with you today, not as a way to teach you about my place. That obviously will happen because it was very centrally located to the place I live in, the context I live in, because of the topic we chose. But I want to talk about that as a model of projects that could happen elsewhere. And that's the important work, because it shouldn't just happen. It shouldn't just be a neat thing and I should hold it up and say, look how neat we are and look what we did. Because that's not what's important. It's important that we work toward this prejudice reduction, that we work toward these understandings, we work to integrate Indigenous understandings and knowledge in all classrooms. And that's the intent of Indian Education for All in Montana. So my story, I came to Missoula from a very rural place because I was on the rodeo team. I got a scholarship to come here on the rodeo team. I don't know if I would have come if I hadn't done that. And if I hadn't come here to do that, I don't know that I'd be standing here today, because I don't know that I would have these understandings, and I wouldn't have worked through this research. And I teach students like me that come from similar places. But I have connections here to this place. I would come up here to Pablo to team rope. I would go up to Kalispell to team rope. I spent a lot of time. I lived in the Bitterroot. But it wasn't always part of my awareness of where I live, that the history here, the culture here, cultures here. And I want to touch on that. Place is important. When I traveled here last night, I passed all kinds of towns that I've been to as a rodeo contestant, and I can see that fairgrounds, and immediately when I see it, I have memories attached to it. I have stories. I have fun times. I have heartbreaks. I have all kinds of things that just seeing a place, going back to a place, remind me of that I wasn't thinking of 2 miles before I got there, but when I see it, I remember it. Place is important. Place is where we hang our memories. It's the scaffolding that we attach ourselves to. And when we run into someone or we meet somebody for the first time, one of the first things we say is, where are you from? And immediately then we start to talk about the people that we might know and share, right? So the people that we know and hold close to us, we collect them in groups of places. And then we start to build connections by sharing those places and sharing those people. And there's just something really powerful about that. And as soon as I figured that out, connected to place-based knowledge, that was the entry point. I met resistance when I tried to integrate Indigenous content into my classroom from my students. But when I packaged it as, this is here, this is our place, this is knowledge, this is history, this is culture that was here, that is here. We're from Crow Country. We're from Crow Country in Columbus, even though we might not realize it. So let's talk about that. So that's where I grew up. I see that place and I can think of all kinds of memories when I look at that. But it was far away from other people. I want to make those connections for my students. But the other thing that's interesting there, this is Canyon Creek, north of Laurel. The Nez Perce in their flight leave the canyon on what's now called the Clark's Fork of the Yellowstone. As they leave Yellowstone National Park and travel north, they cross the Yellowstone River at Laurel, and they travel along down there from the top left part of that image. They travel along those rims, and they made a hard left turn there across the bottom to the right to head up a canyon. And that's how the Canyon Creek gets its name. But the road that's there now, I grew up on that road. It's called Buffalo Trail Road, and I just always thought it was just a name that white people put on things to make them sound like they're Western and cowboy and stuff, right? But I didn't know that it's a traditional point of travel for buffalo herds to travel from the Yellowstone, from south of the Yellowstone up to like what's now Harlowton and Judith Gap. And I mean, if ever there was a kid who should have known about Native connections to place, there I was. But I didn't have it because it wasn't in my history books at school. It wasn't in my textbooks. And there was actually a battle there. The U.S. Army pursuing the Nez Perce through that area. Nez Perce stop, and women, children, and the elders move on, and they set up an ambush and stop the U.S. Army to slow them down successfully. If ever there was a place for a student, for a kid to learn about federal Indian policy and its effects on Native people, there I was. But I didn't have it. Like there's this thing about evidence, like personal experience, primary research, secondary research. There's three ways we get our evidence to believe what we believe. And so many of our students, but if we're watching the election, we know that it's also true about adults, right? So many people base what they know on personal experience, and it's limited. Okay? Especially in rural contexts, it's limited. So I wanted to find a way to incorporate primary research, secondary research into that, because in the place of that we end up with myths, and the myth of the open, available, empty, open, unused space. Images like Dr. Mount Pleasant shared today of that field with the mounds in it. That's an image that would counter that myth, right? It's not just empty, open, unused space. There are things that happened, and we need to know that. We need to know that so that we can make decisions that aren't really stupid decisions. And we can make decisions about relationships toward the future. And our students need that knowledge. All students, Native and non-Native students, need that knowledge to make decisions for the future. So, with that in mind, here's South Central Montana, and our landscapes are texts. They tell stories. Stories are held there. Just like driving by, maybe you have already thought of some places that hold memories for you, places that have stories. Okay, I have all kinds of stories on that map. But I also teach there. I grew up on that map. I teach on that map. I raised my family on that map. And there are stories there. But along with that picture of South Central Montana, starting over here, we have Gardner in the bottom left, up to Livingston about midway on the left. And then the Yellowstone. You can see the path of the Yellowstone along the interstate there, all the way to Warden, up to Custer, and it goes beyond to Hysham. Starting in 1868, everything south of that river, from Gardner to Livingston, and everything south of the Yellowstone was the Crow Reservation. I live on what was once the Crow Reservation. I didn't know that. I didn't know that when I bought it. I didn't know that when I built my house. It wasn't part of my cultural awareness of the place that I live. So my students have that too. For the most part, my students have that too. It doesn't even cross their mind when, say, a basketball team like Lodgegrass comes to play Columbus. It doesn't cross their mind that name of that town is across their chest when they go to play basketball, Columbus. So we need to start up unpacking that in classrooms. So the state law, it says it's the Montana legislature's intent that every Montana, whether Indian or non-Indian, be encouraged to learn about the distinct and unique heritage of American Indians in a culturally responsive manner. That's an important part right there. And every educational agency and all educational personnel will work cooperatively with Montana tribes or those tribes that are in close proximity. There's a lot to unpack in there, but that part about every educational agency, every school in the state of Montana will do that. That's part of the law, and it stems from a part in the Constitution. It's in it's under school finance and property taxes. That when property taxes are collected in Montana, a portion of that money will go to fulfill that. Which means that every school that isn't doing that, that takes state money, I mean, I could make the argument that that's fraud, right? Every teacher who earns a salary from Montana tax funds that doesn't incorporate that, you could make the argument that that's fraud. And that it's my duty, it's my obligation to share this knowledge and this awareness with my students. And that's important. And it's different. I've been all across the state talking about this, and it's different. Western Montana, believe it or not, is maybe 10 years ahead of Eastern Montana on these topics. I was just in Miles City last week. And I just in the number, like the crowds that I can talk to when I come to Western Montana, go to Miles City with another consortium of schools, and I got 12 people. And that's from like the High Line clear down to southeastern Montana. I got 12 teachers. So it's happening, but they're behind. And we need to keep working on that. And obviously I'll make a case here. Politics is really important to that. So superintendent of schools is a really important position. So we need to vote. There's 3 community contexts when we talk about doing this type of research, though. Like when we go to decide to make a project, they all have their own like mix of similarities and differences. But reservation communities are unique in comparison to reservation adjacent communities. There's some similarities, but there's some differences. But then I would call myself, I'd say I'm in that third group, off-reservation communities. But even that's complicated because Columbus is right on the edge of the Yellowstone River, which was once right across from the Crow Reservation. So we might think we're off-reservation, but we're not. Okay? And you folks from MSU today that shared, your projects I see very much in the spirit of those first two. But there's some decisions that are different that I have to make. So like when I'm deciding where to focus. I'm in an off-reservation community, say in Jordan, Montana. If I was a teacher in Jordan, Montana, I'd have to make a decision as to what area, what tribe, what culture I would focus on to help students like understand the place that they live in. And there's a protocol that I've developed that I've been sharing with teachers as to how to go through that process, how to get started, because getting started is the hardest part. Whereas if I was teaching a Wolf Point, there would be a very easy and ready focus for me to start with. So there's a process to go through with that. There's been funding available. I got started through a grant with OPI, the Montana Office of Public Instruction, and the Montana Historical Society brought grant funding to schools that would work with museums, with their local museum, and develop curriculum, but also develop museum content to reflect Indian education for all. And it brought museums in on like totally revising the way they present indigenous cultures. So the project we came to was this driving tour, and that was the handout that I had on the chairs. The finished product looks like this. It's a driving tour brochure where students picked locations and stories that documented the Crow tribe's influence in our community. And it was really impactful because even like the location of the towns, Absaroka, where I live, is located where it's at because of the location of the second Crow agency. Columbus is where it's at because it was the border town and it was the closest point that white traders could set up shop in relationship to the agency. And then the agency moves and the reservation moves, and it's deliberately forgotten. And now we're left with what's left of that, right? And so my students needed to kind of go through this process. But then it was an important part to then be able to share what they learned and educate the community on that, because I would guess 98, 99% of the community had no knowledge of that. That was important. So the finished product was this driving tour brochure where visitors to our community, but also community residents, can pick this up. It's for free. It's right at the front desk in the museum. Pick it up, and they can either read it and, with their own knowledge of the place, connect the stories to that, or they can actually go and follow the driving tour and go learn about that. From that, the museum has also generated some revenue by holding bus tours. I've done bus tours with conservation-minded folks who want to preserve the second agency and the history there, because a plow keeps going back and forth over the top of the agency site on an annual basis. But then also we've brought school children in, students from St. Charles in Pryor on the Crow Reservation. I've hosted students, elementary students from Lodgegrass, and taught them, which seems like a really just asinine concept that I'm teaching students about Crow history. But what I end up doing is telling some stories and getting them to tell their stories and what it connects for them, because we share that space in that moment. We share that space, and so I share some stories from this space, and they connect their experience with that story that I just told to stories that they've heard from their parents, from their elders, from their family members, and that's an important part of that process. I also have I've written it up for the Montana Office of Public Instruction. I've written up a research project guide for teachers to recreate this in their own place. And if any of you work with teachers, I can make that available. I have paper copies down here, but I can also provide it to you in a PDF format, so you can email it to them if you want to maybe start that conversation. But OPI is actually transforming that into an online course for teachers that they can actually go through, study what my students did, and brainstorm ways that they could incorporate it into their community, into their place, and they can earn OPI licensure renewal credits toward that by taking that online course. But the basics of the guide are this. They need to start where they're at. It does them... I don't want to say it's not valuable, because it is valuable to learn about, say, what happened on the East Coast. Because a lot of our textbooks in Montana talk about contact on the East Coast, or contact in the Caribbean. But I don't want to say that's not important. But my students will never understand the context of where they live and how federal Indian policy affected their place unless we start there and move out from there. Okay, so that's an important start. And then they need to find that focus. What culture are they going to begin that work with? And maybe that will lead them to other studies of other cultures as well. They need to get directions and advice. And that means that, to go back to what the law said, they need to work in close proximity with Montana tribes. They need to seek out cultural advisors to help them on that journey so that it's authentic work, that it's genuine, that it represents what that culture would like out there. That it authentically represents the history and the culture, because you have advisors to run that past, to help you on that journey, to look over what the students create, to make sure that you don't put something out there that's not culturally responsive. That's can be dangerous. But that's different in those different contexts, right? That's especially dangerous for me because of my distance from a reservation. But it's also important, like here with the tribal, I'm forgetting the official name of it, but there's a board that officially looks at content, and here that a teacher would want to run that past that board. Yes. In order to make sure that is culturally approved, and the process by which you go to gather that information and also publish that information is culturally responsive. So there's different things that teachers have to consider in different places. Come on. Then a big part of the work as a teacher is to help students make it personal. Okay, this is something that happened here, and that happens in a variety of ways. Like, for some students, it's picking a spot that is directly related to their farm or their ranch or their homestead. That this happened here. This is part of my story and part of where I live. But it also might be where I went hunting with my grandpa, or it might be where I go fishing. It might be, for some students, they move in and they're new to the area. They're from out of state, and for them, it's helping them. It takes a different focus for them. I pair them up with somebody who does have a close connection to a place, and they develop an understanding of the place as they're moving in through the study and the research. So even that gives that student's connected to a different place back home and is probably homesick for that place. That gives them something to know and to hold on to when they move to the new place through that process. So it's kind of dynamic in that way. And then just the importance of doing authentic research work. I want this to be able to be of value to my community. I want it to be of value to the Abzalika people. I want it to be I want it to teach a lesson. I want it to teach knowledge. I want it to raise awareness. I want it to become part of the cultural knowledge of living in Stillwater County. And they've said it before, but it's important to understand that Indian education for all should change what it means to be Montana. It should change what it means up here to be Montana. There's a knowledge, there's an understanding, there's an awareness that should come with being a Montana. So, the landscape just tells a story, and I can use maps to help me with that process. I mean, Google Maps is a great tool in showing that to students, that there's Mission Creek, the site of the first Crow Agency, that there's Abzorki, the site of the second Crow Agency, and there's Crow Agency Montana, and just that visual tells a story. Events happen. How did that happen? Well, and in education we call that inquiry. There's inquiry can lead to research. We ask questions. We go seek out the answers. And that's part of that understanding. I talked before about the relationship of Columbus to Abzorki, and the locations of our towns, the names of our towns, are deeply tied to our connections to the Crow tribe. Place names, some projects earlier from you folks mentioned this too, the place names, the cultural awareness. There's a park in Columbus, Montana called Itchkapee Park. It's a city park. And all my students go down there. They go down there in the mornings. They go down there at lunch. They go down there after school. I don't even want to know what they do there. Okay? It's a fishing access, but but it's as we researched into it, it's in the driving tour brochure. It's a slang version of a Crow word that Bishkapashi, which means rose hip bush, which is, if you're familiar with the area, there's the Stillwater River and then there's the rosebuds, east and west rosebud, that flow into the Stillwater River. In the driving tour brochure, you'll see those names actually flipped prior to 1876. A map maker flipped them on a map. But if you go to the Crow names for those streams, it makes total sense. If you go to the local history books to understand how the Stillwater River got its name, it goes, and stop me if you've heard this one, it goes something like this. There once was an Indian princess who, how many local history books have these mythologies in them that don't help our students understand, where they live? Stillwater, it translates to still water in Crow, which was in reference to the beaver dams that were on what's now called the Rosebud. And the Rosebud isn't still anymore, which then brings in new inquiry, like, why isn't it still? Well, there aren't those beaver dams anymore. Why aren't there beaver dams anymore? Because trapping and the impact of trapping on the wildlife and the landscape. So it's all connected. Place names are a great place to start. I just celebrate when I come up here. I ask my wife to drive when we come up here, because then I can read the place names. I just love that. And I love that on the Crow Reservation as well, to see the place names. That's so important. And every Montanan's awareness of what the place names are and why the stories attached to those names helps us understand where we live Every Montana, native and non-native. And it's an important part of our Montana cultural awareness as a state and the people of a state. So there's other stops in there. I mean, the Yellowstone River is another great one. That one is actually has a national impact. We have a national park, Yellowstone National Park. Name is totally based on a French mistranslation of Plains Indian Sign Language. So, and I probably don't need to say that on the Flathead Reservation, like what mistranslation can do, right? But, Yellowstone Park, the Yellowstone River, the longest free-flowing river in North America. And then Billings has Yellowstone County, all of them based on mistranslation. But once we understand what the names are, what the names mean, it makes the places we live in make more sense. The 11 different indigenous cultures have a word in their language. The name for the Yellowstone River in their language translates to Elk River or Elk Crossing River. And you go to Gardner, Montana, and it makes perfect sense. You go to Columbus, Montana, it makes perfect sense. You go to Forsyth, Montana, it makes perfect sense. Elk back and forth across that thing. So even this map of my city that I teach in, there are so many stories, so many cultural stories, so many points of Crow influence on that map. There are allotments on that map. I found out through another cultural advisor, Carol Murray at Blackfeet Community College, shared with me about a special provision in the Dawes Act that allowed for allotments off the reservation. And so there are allotments just south of Columbus there, south of the river, that transferred into homesteads through mixed marriage. And those families stayed in the community. In the first, I can look up in the primary resources in my museum and show my students a picture of the first class when the school was built in Columbus. It was made up of like 50% Crow students. And that's our history. That's the school I teach in. And that is a surprise to the primarily non-native students who now go to school there. But they need to have that awareness. And so what we learned, this applies everywhere. Every square inch of Montana has been influenced by indigenous peoples. And we can extend that outward, right? That's the country too. But it was important in Montana to really pinpoint that when sharing it with teachers, that every square inch of Montana was influenced by indigenous peoples, and this project can happen anywhere. And then all you have to do is start where you're at. Am I okay on time? Running out of it? So OPI has maps like this available that can help teachers pinpoint that. I recommend starting like proximity to reservation, and if you're like equidistant to reservations, then I would recommend to those teachers that I would look at the traditional homeland. The reservation connection seems to like help them in their immediate context and their social connections in the present. But I think back to that image of where I grew up, the image of my home. There's a continuum of time there. That buffalo have used that trail for thousands of years, and that means people use that trail for thousands of years. And they had stories there, and they had memories there, and I added my story to that place. And I share that place with people from the past, I share that place with people in the present, and I share that place with people in the future. And that's what I try through this project to communicate to my students, that we share place in a continuum of time. And if we can understand that we share that place, then the relationship, the people-to-people relationship, has an opening. And we can build understanding from that. We can reduce prejudice with that. We can reduce hate and intolerance with that. So I'm going to finish up there, but should we do questions? Okay. Thank you. Yes, please.
What grade do you teach? So I have two questions. What grade do you teach? And do you share a personal change in your life journey as a result of sharing this thing?
I teach 10th and 12th graders for about the last 10 years. I started out 9th and 10th, but 10th and 12th now. Personally, I have very young children that have come about since I started this. And I am very conscious of the conversations that I have with my children about the place where we live. As we talk about change, if my students can get this same knowledge, they will have different conversations with their children. But I share this knowledge with my kids as just part of everyday talk. I take them to places. I take my son fishing, and we enjoy that place together in the present. But I also share with him the stories of that place. I share with him the names. Like he went with me to. He's in 3rd grade, and he went with me to Miles City, and he got to listen to me talk there. And as we came back, we stopped at Pompey's Pillar, and obviously there's a lot of like that in history books, Pompey's Pillar. But the Crow name for that location is the Mountain Lands Lodge. And so we talked about that. And we talked about how that made sense. We crawled up on top and we talked about that and how it made sense and how it connected to Grandpa's place back where I grew up and how it connected to where we live. So that's an important part of this, like integrating that just naturally into conversation. So that I want to live in a world that makes sense. And I want him to live in a world that makes sense. I want him to understand where he lives. And, as I'm here, surrounded by Salish, Kootenai, and Pend Oreille cultures, that 15,000 years of plus time immemorial of knowledge about a place, if I'm going to live here, that's important for me. And I want to convey that to him. I want to convey that to my students, but I want to convey that to him. And if I can do that as a teacher, I can't go into every home and fix every home situation. But if I can help my students now with that continuum of time toward the present, then I can make an impact, and I can help them understand where they live. Mm-hmm. Other questions? Yes, please.
It's not a question, it's a comment, because we have exact same thing. Like, all our students know that when people start to say, like, what does that name mean? They just say, like, it's just a name. That's when it starts to slip away from us. Yes. So we have that place names, and then we come and ask, like, what does that mean? Even if it's in Mongolian, it's like one word for elk trail. And it's not elk trail, it's just one word, and it means that. And now the language is turning into more explanatory, which is poorer. Right. And then when we come to the place and ask, like, what does that mean? People don't know, it's just a name. And if they know the meaning of the word, they would know what place it looks like and how you can use it. And how it is attached to your life and everything, just like you said. So it's international. So yes. It's nice that as an educator you are pointing it out, and we, as Mongolians, we need to do the same thing too, because it's like they said, you guys are from the future. Like Mongolians are way behind of you guys, which is good in some ways, but bad in some ways. So we have lots to learn from you guys. So.
Thank you.
Nice. Congratulations for doing this work.
Good time for another one?
Okay.
Yes.
I'm from Washington State, and we copied Montana's Indian Education for All.
Good for
and
you.
I'm going to talk to all the deans of the teacher education programs on Friday. So I would like some of your materials. This is a wonderful, wonderful example.
Thank you. And I would say that, like, when I talk about getting directions, you all as researchers are in a role to serve as advisors, cultural advisors. We work with archaeologists, we work with architects, we work with archivists, we work with researchers and anthropologists. So we went to them to help us along that journey, along with traditional storytellers and historians, indigenous storytellers and historians. So that's one thing I want to really point out, that you have a role in this, that you can contribute to this.
It's really, you're building community in really interesting ways, I think.
Thank you. Thank you.
Isn't he great? Aren't you glad that I brought him here? And that he accepted?
Thank you. If any of you want the actual brochure, I do have a limited number here, so feel free to take one if that would help you with the work that you do.
Casey,
Yes.
Can you put up your first slide, the one?
Yes.
Lauren, may I make a comment also?
Yep. A little bit further. The diagram one, I guess.
And may I just point out that here, and I think on many, many reservations, it's not just the IRB that we would talk to, but we would ask the elders for their permission and ask them if they believe that the curriculum is accurate. The IRB would be secondary, really.
Yeah.
Reservation and reservation adjacent communities, the students can actually help locate those. The experts, the cultural experts and advisors, might be their grandma, their auntie, they have people at home that bring that home culture to school to help in that process. That's another important direction that one can take. Thank you, everyone.
Oh, yeah.
That's because we're running a statewide Native case.